Ja, da ønsker jeg velkommen til denne sesjonen. Mitt navn Tor Christian Lorang. Jeg ansvarlig for det vi i cProcurement gjør mot offentlig sektor her i Norge. Og vi har ca. 250 mennesker som til enhver tid jobber med offentlige kunder, så vi føler oss litt meningsberettiget. Jeg synes det veldig inspirerende å være her i dag. En annen ting som veldig inspirerende for meg å jobbe mot offentlig sektor i Norge, det at i cProcurement så har vi noe som heter Global Public Sector. Og deres jobb å følge med på det som skjer i alle offentlige prosjekter i cProcurement. Vi ca. 100 000 mennesker nå, og ca. 30 000 av dem jobber med offentlige prosjekter. Og disse gutta som jobber i Global Public Sector, de har det ansvaret for å følge med, samle inn kunnskap, dele kunnskap, sånn at jeg og vi som da jobber i Norge kan prøve å hjelpe til å få våre kunder til å bli enda bedre. And I'm pleased to welcome Graham, who is one of those central guys in the Global Public Sector. He is particularly involved in EU projects, and we heard today from the minister that she claims that Norway is leading edge when it comes to eGovernment. And we would like to actually hear from you, Graham. Is that true? And how are Norway perceived, and what is EU doing when it comes to eGovernment? So, welcome.
Thanks very much indeed, Tor Christian. Good afternoon, everybody. Jag talar inte Norse, and that's about as far as it goes. So I hope you'll suffer in English. It's a foreign language for me. I'm a Scotsman, and I just need to make that very clear at the beginning. I'd like to talk to you about a number of different things, but I'd like to ask you a question first. So this is the point of the day, which is towards the end, and we're going to do a little exercise, and it only involves one arm. So who in this room believes that it is possible to make public services twice as good in half the time for half as much? Who in this room believes that? Not bad, not quite as good as the Finns, but then again, they are known for innovation. What I'd like to do is I'd like to talk to you about that, because I believe that's very necessary, and I believe it's very possible. So, in terms of doing that, how do I intend to do that? What I'd like to do is I'd like to start and talk about why transformation is so important. And we'll do that two different ways. One is looking forward into the future, and one is starting with today. So we'll talk about why transformation is so important. And then after that, I'd like to look at how Europe is doing versus the world, and then look at how Norway is doing, specifically on benchmarking of the use of technology in government. After that, I'd like to look at suggesting a completely new model of how we construct government, which is what I believe is needed. And then I'm going to show you some examples of real-life cases of making things twice as good in half the time for half as much. And then hopefully we have some time to have an argument, because otherwise it would be pointless to come here. So I'd like a debate at the end with some views from you. So let's start off in terms of transformation. We're going to do some visual mathematics here. So look at this picture. This picture shows you the world's population today. Okay? And it's actually by population rather than by physical space. Now look at the picture. Look at a couple of the countries in terms of looking at particularly America or Africa. Ready? Next one. It changes somewhat, because this is about CO2. This is about shocking consumerism in America and not a lot going on in Africa. So let's just have a little flash at that picture again. Have a look there. Do the maths. Do the maths and figure out what happens today if you multiply those numbers together. Because I don't know how many of you have been out to India or China, but I have. I spent quite a lot of time out there, and they want to mimic other parts of the world. Is that a good thing? and how do we change things? Let me add on to that something that makes it even worse. Now, let's have a look at the audience. 50% of you are blessed. The other 50% don't feel bad about it. The guys that are blessed will probably leave a problem behind for you. But the 50% of the audience, in your lifetime, the population of the world is going to treble. That's never happened before, and it will never happen again. So remember, go back to visual mathematics and start doing those numbers and multiply it by 3. We have a bit of a problem that we need to deal with. And it's actually going to come to our kids, not necessarily to ourselves. And we need to deal with that. And it could be in your lifetime. So let's unpick some of that. This is aging. We're basically going to have 4 times as many 85-plus-year-olds in the majority of developed Europe by 2025 than we have today. What is the cost of that? This is the bathtub that shows the cost in the first couple of years of life and in the back end of life. So there's an impending massive healthcare cost as a result of that. These figures are a fair forecast and are quite scary. So what does that mean? My favorite picture of the bright lights. There's a whole variety of issues which you can sit in Norway or you can sit in any particular place and country and say, well, do you know what? The population is not trebling in Norway in my lifetime. But my point is that because of these things, because of what's going on in a global world, because of consumption, a lot of the problems actually come up here. And the top of that picture, in terms of what's happening up there, which was frozen, may not necessarily be frozen in a few years' time. So things that are going on in other parts of the world are genuine in terms of creating problems in the developed world. What is Europe's role in influencing that? Because I believe that Europe plays a vital role in influencing what happens when you look east. I actually also think it plays a vital role in terms of what's happening in America. So a lot of countries look to Europe to learn. So if we can change things fundamentally by using technology in a smarter way, then that would be a good thing. And maybe we can actually help the whole process. Because my question is not one of sustainability, which is today's agenda. I actually pose that at the end of some of the people in this room's lifetime, it's about viability, not about sustainability. This is Blobby the fish. And this is the sort of thing that we're going fishing for these days. We're digging it up from the bowels of the sea and even contemplating eating these sorts of things. And we're writing interesting books and films. I don't know who's seen The End of the Line. And the UN is a fairly recognized outfit, and they're forecasting that if we carry on fishing the rate we're fishing, then we're going to run out of fish in 40 years. Now, we may not, and there's lots of things that we're doing to influence that, but these are profoundly important points. Now, you may say, what's technology got to do about that? But fishing fleets need monitored. Fishing catches need monitored. A lot of the actual product needs monitored. So there's a huge amount of activity in terms of how technology can influence that. You won't be able to see this, but don't matter. There's a chap called Richard Watson who's written a wonderful book called A Brief History of the Next 50 Years. And in that, he draws this map, which looks like the underground of the UK. The important thing about the message behind me is that it indicates some forecast of what's happening now, but what's happening in the next 5 to 10 years and beyond. And the important thing is that technology is endemic in a huge proportion of these forecasts. So technology undoubtedly is a key influencer in terms of what's happening just now, in terms of major business systems as we move forward. This normally scares most nations. So let me just describe what it is. This is a picture of the forecast in terms of total government debt in 2013 as a proportion of the GDP. And down here we have the average budget balance from 2009 to 2013. And as you can see, Norway is the Arabs of the north in a particular place. Do you know what's interesting about that is if you look at the countries that are really pushing transformation right now, They're being forced to. I live in the UK, I live in London. That's England, by the way, for a Scotsman. That's a bad place to live. But the UK are under intense pressure to fundamentally change the way that they construct government. And the economic crisis is a really wonderful thing to drive that transformation. So what is it that drives transformation in Norway? Because you're sort of sitting there with a lot of money and it doesn't really matter. However, there is a productivity point in terms of the aging and the change of the dynamics of and demographics in Norway. But my question, I guess, to you is there sufficient driver in Norway to push the whole aspect of efficiency? Because you're certainly seeing it in other parts of the world. So let's look at the current experience. That was going out and looking at aspects of the future. Let's look at the current experience in terms of what happens. And if you have a variety of different departments that you need to interface with in terms of public services, it kind of tends to be a little bit disjointed. That's my personal experience, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And my guess is that you have ones like this too. So on one side of this is a summons to court. I was invited to come to court. Now, I'd had several communications clearly before I was invited to come to court. And on the right-hand side are two cheques that add up to £439.42. So on one side they're saying, come to court. And the other side they're saying, here's two cheques. It's from the same organisation. It's for the same thing. It's just they were slightly confused between the various different departments, and it came down to, and I had a very odd name, lived in the same location for the last 8 years, so there's nothing I'd done to change. But for some reason they just managed to get themselves confused. They changed some code. So from that perspective, my council in the UK has completely lost my trust. Because I don't like receiving invitations to go to court for something that I haven't done wrong. Because in fact, I'd overpaid my council tax. And so they sent me two cheques back. It's just that the whole department didn't know. So these are real-life situations. This is another email I got from a friend of mine who said, does anybody know all of the rules and regulations about setting up a business in France? Because I'm a small organisation and I'd like to expand internationally. And it seems to be very complicated. There's too many people, too many forms, and it's all confusing. So he was actually held back from moving abroad in terms of his business because of complexity of administration and bureaucracy. Now, the European Commission understand that, and they've had a whole aspect of cutting red tape as part of that. But this is another story of making it hard for growing the economy, which is not a good idea. Here's my fat kids diagram. This is a picture of how shockingly convoluted the whole system is, both at a national level and at a local level. What actually happened in the UK is back in 2004, they said, let's halt obesity of children under 11 by 2010. They failed singularly to do that, by the way. In fact, it's got worse. So they had thousands of people all sitting there as experts, figuring out, what do we mean by obesity? They defined that. That took a while. They had lots of experts working on that. And this diagram shows the 100 or so departments, or 20 departments, and 5 major organizations in terms of central government involved in the process. The end output is delay, is frustration, and is more obesity. But actually the end outcome is that a lot of people actually end up with psychological disorders that continue for decades. So we need to restructure government and not have situations like this. So that's today. It's a broken system, and it basically needs fundamental reconstruction. So my take is, both from the long term, we've got some significant issues to deal with, and the short term is a little broken. Now let me pause at that point if anybody would like to challenge or disagree or agree. Does that, you must have a story in your own minds and in your experience which kind of hits to those issues. Norway is different, I'm sure, but I'm sure that there's some challenges. So the first part then is about the issues. Let me move on to there and actually look at how you can use technology both in Europe and beyond, and also benchmarking against that. So in terms of Europe, going back a number of years, we've had a variety of different plans. The I-2010 Action Plan, I don't know how familiar or not familiar you are to these sorts of things, but these are very laudable documents that come out, and at the moment there's an action plan that's being pulled together to actually pull what was put together in Malmö in terms of a commitment. There's some consistent themes coming through about efficiency and effectiveness and about customer centricity. And then underneath that, there's a lot around the key enablers. We also observe this one here, which is back in 2005, all the countries got together and said, let's have 100% of public procurement online by 2010, 100%, and 50% of it used. So that's a specific target set 5 years back by 2010. So these are good ambitions. I'm not trying to say they're bad ambitions. They're good ambitions, and we write them up in documents. We pause at a moment. This is what, from the eGovernment benchmark survey, this is what the old member states and the, shall we say, new member states said in terms of the top 5 priorities. So they took the text from the top 5 priorities and populated that. And there's perhaps some words up there you go, yep, that looks familiar. And it's good in terms of the big ones or the important ones. And that's a year ago. Now the interesting thing is there's one word missing from that, which is stuck right there. And it won't come out far enough. But it's cloud. The conversation about cloud technology is something that public services these days are very much using as the current term. And a year ago it didn't exist. It wasn't on any of the priorities. So it's moving fast. And we need to respond fast. Some text just so that we're familiar with the documents. And I think that Commissioner Kroes will be here with us tomorrow morning. That clearly will cover off the digital agenda. And I think that's a very important aspect of not only setting the scene for EU at that level, but also helping to connect that with what's going on in the various different countries. One of the things which I think is important and is lifting the agenda up from national solutions to trans-European solutions is something called the Competitiveness and Innovation Programme. It's a set of pilots which involve typically somewhere between half a dozen and 15 or so countries in Europe. And interesting, Norway is leading this one here on public procurement, which is great. As a non-EU member, you're leading a European project, and I think that's absolutely excellent. And the reasons behind it are very good. So we've got one covering procurement, one covering business startup, one covering identity, one covering justice and health. Those latter two have just got started. The important thing here are these building blocks. Now, in Norway, you have Altinn as an initiative that's been in place for several years now that will be part of the building blocks of trans-European public services. So remember the story about Peter, who's sending the email around saying, I don't know what to do to start up a business. These are some of the building blocks that makes it easy so that we draw one competitive Europe. And that's clearly the ambition that underpins a lot of what we're doing. Let me move now towards benchmarking and talk about why you do that and talk about how it's done, and then actually look at some of the results. So we set bold ambitions to be the most competitive, what does it say, the most dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. There's a missing bit at the end of that that says by 2010, for those that may have read it some years back. And I don't think that we are the most dynamic and competitive knowledge economy in the world this year. That would be my take on things. So we have those policies, and we've developed them into programs, and then for that we try and actually learn and improve. And the benchmarking process is about trying to address what programs are in place and what progress is being made. The important thing that is we're shifting towards is actually trying to drive two things. One is learning and accelerated learning through connecting countries that want to make a difference on specific topics. So by getting half a dozen countries together to actually pull together action learning groups And importantly, as you'll see as I move forward, the in-country benchmarking benefits from having some person that's coordinating a whole host of different data points that we're collecting, and that will become apparent as I go into it. In terms of Europe, the challenge we have at the moment is to compare what's going on across what is the 27 countries of Europe plus 4, which is Iceland, Switzerland, and a couple of others that I forget. The message is that what we do is we collect that together, and actually we look internally and compare Europe country to country. And that's good, that's good. But it's certainly not enough, because actually what's required is to compare Europe with other major blocks around the world. Now, to give you an example of that, there's the collection of 5 countries, which are the English-speaking ones, that get together, and to be quite frank with you, the UK connects with those more than it connects with Europe, in my view. So the comparison is about what is it that Canada are doing in terms of customer centricity, what is it America doing in terms of driving policy faster, what is it that Australia is doing in terms of innovation. But that's not all, because out in Korea and Japan and the other rich Arabs, they have lots of money and they have ambition. So Bahrain and Abu Dhabi have got a stated intent to be one of the top 5 governments in the world by 2012. And that's pretty ambitious. And you know what? They're not short of cash. They've probably got more than you have. So they'll do something about that. So we absolutely must deal with that. And we must deal with that because in our lifetimes, we're not going to matter. The places that are going to matter are the resource-rich places like Brazil, who are accelerating very rapidly, and India and China that have got 1+ billion people in their countries all the time. So the message here is it's all interesting to compare internally within Europe, but the sooner that we can actually look at Europe as a whole and influence the rest of the world, the better. So let's look at performance. I don't know how many are familiar with the report. It's coming out in the middle of December. But there's a report that, looking backwards, has been a slightly rusty implement, particularly in the last few years. What we are doing at the moment is going through 2 years of substantial change. The first year was supposed to be half a step, the second year half a step. The reality of the situation is we made some fairly significant advances last year, but actually there's probably 2/3 of a step this year, which I'll describe. So I think now we've got something which will be a far richer information source. And I guarantee that of all the 32 countries, there's probably not one of them that sits there and says, the design of the tool is absolutely perfect for me, which is what's intended there. Our challenge in terms of collaboration, in terms of the consortium, is to try and find not the happy medium, but the common core of what people actually wanted to create in terms of a core instrument to make comparison. What's important about this would be, last year we were looking at 14,000 websites around Europe. That's a very large statistical population. This year we're actually increasing the number of data points and enriching it across a larger landscape. So other things, this is probably something that's fairly self-intuitive in terms of development over time. Back in the 2000s we were one-way interaction and information. Now, as Europe, we sit at a transactional or indeed a sort of targetization, personalization level. So we have moved and advanced over the years in terms of the old benchmark, which looked at 20 services, citizen services, there were 12 of those. They're still entirely consistent and still entirely relevant, but how we use them is what I'm going to move to. And we look at 8 business services. Here's a slide that shows a sort of 9% improvement on average. Businesses are ahead, citizens behind. That's very natural. Citizen services are a lot more heterogeneous. As citizens, we behave in a very different way. And there's a heck of a lot more services that are delivered to citizens than there are to businesses. So that's the progress that Europe's made. Aspects, again, at the European level. This is showing 4 categories. Getting the money from people as fast as is possible in terms of taxes and VAT, and Europe has been ahead on that as government for a long time. In other words, you can pay your taxes online very quickly, and that's good for government. The interesting two areas, one is permits and licenses, fishing licenses, dog licenses, all these sorts of things, and registration for cars, for marriage, for birth. Citizen services has naturally been a long way behind, and thankfully are slowly catching up. So we'll take your money fast as regards government, but if we want to give you services, then maybe it's not quite so good. That's important. For one word, trust. Because moving forward, we need to change how we deal with things. This is a bit of an eye chart, but this is the picture of what was reported last year. The report last year, basically, you can read the top line. It covered off 5 strategic priorities for Norway, some examples of successes in the last 2 years, and some best practices. So for each country, we have, in the past, pulled this sort of information together. Now, if you compare where Norway is, and to the Minister's point, Norway is about average, I guess. So there's the average line. And this is dealing with online availability, which is it there as a service, and sophistication, which is how good is it if it was there. And Norway, excuse me, Norway looks sort of on average. I bet you, and there's a lot of countries that say, yeah, but that doesn't feel right for us either. And so what we're measuring this year will help improve that. But up here you can see Norway at the beginning of the century was well ahead, and now is somewhat flatlined in terms of this 20-service measurement. Looking at it from one aspect, the Nordic generally, so this is Finland, this is Denmark, there's Norway. The Nordic countries demonstrate one feature, which is the gap between the investment in making services available and people actually using them is a lot less than it is on average across Europe. So generally there's a 30% gap between the availability of service and the actual usage. That means that we're investing ahead of the curve, and that driving people online would be a good thing. So you guys are more comfortable to use technology as a tool to access services. And Norway sits there, again, sort of on average in terms of performance, but the gap is quite small. This takes that and unpicks it into citizens and businesses. Now, unlike the majority of Europe, which has got an 80% availability and a 30% use, which is a massive gap, Norway is in a very good position, which just reinforces that as citizens, in the citizen population, you're very comfortable to access online services. And businesses, you know, the gap is less and you're more within the group. So that's a good position to move forward from. There's a lot of benefits as a result of doing that. Here's one that I'm sure created a degree of tension, which is around e-procurement, which suggests that you're a little bit below average. And what the e-procurement one does, there's 1.3 trillion euros of public procurement across Europe annually. There's a lot of money. So it's about spending that money wisely. It's about understanding at the pre-award level what better decisions we can make in terms of informing the procurement process, and also at the transactional area in terms of being efficient around transactions. It's a very difficult thing to measure in this particular area. Very difficult indeed. We've changed the measurement this year to try and do a little bit more from the standpoint of qualitative measurement so we get different data points. This is looking at user experience, which I've got to say I was somewhat surprised about. Because if you go back a few slides where you're looking at Norway actually being very comfortable to use online services, this suggests that's the European average against 5 different points of usability of online sites, accessibility, which is for impaired vision and such like, user satisfaction monitoring, where the indications are that last year anyway, that wasn't in place. A one-stop shop approach, multi-channel access, these sorts of things, and the sort of user-focused design principles. Norway was less advanced than I would have imagined. Interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens this year, by the way. So this is now moving back to a European level, and there's some intriguing things here happening in terms of governance. So part of the landscaping work we do is to assess priorities, assess what different countries are doing in different domains. So a few key messages that were clearly coming out. The first is that it doesn't work unless you align business with technology. I think we'd all see that as important, and we'd understand it. That it is a transformational agenda. What is interesting is this pack in the middle in terms of how, who owns the technology agenda in different countries. Does it go into the Ministry of Finance? Does it go into the Ministry of Trade? Does it split and go into different places, which is actually what's happening in Norway? So how do we actually construct, and what power of governance has the technology agenda got? My belief is that competence, as well as some degree of accountability and drive, is a very important foundation stone in order for countries to progress. Other things that are interesting here in terms of collaboration, so the need for the silos to stop being silos and connect and work together, the development of skills, also the aspect of making sure that we deal with service delivery not from the silos of government, but actually engage other parties, third sector organizations, charities, not-for-profit organizations, and such like in that. And this concept of constant beta testing. It's not normal for a civil servant to be comfortable to put a piece of technology which is just designed and may not work perfectly out into the open. That's called taking risk, and it's understandable. But that's the sort of thing that needs to happen in terms of moving forward. So these are the insights that came out from last year. And we put together 5 characteristics, which I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but it's about making sure that you've got top-level support, making sure that the e-government strategy is inclusive of a variety of different points, that government mechanisms, most importantly, help to drive the whole aspect of collaboration. Customer mindset is coming through in most places. And I think the whole aspect of results is important. So those are sort of 5 criteria of what it looks like good looks like in various different countries. Now, a few moments around, so what's happening this year in terms of upgrading the challenge. This gives the overview of the whole thing. Don't worry too much about that. That's just a sort of framework that we use. But these are the various different dimensions of the measurement this year, which will give a far, far richer tapestry of information for us to draw conclusions from. So the first, in terms of landscaping, it's looking at policies, it's looking at priorities, it's looking at programs, similar but richer to last year in terms of what we're going to do to draw insight from it. The second is maintained and improved from a pilot of last year around user insights and user experience, which is about different forms of access, satisfaction, and actually trying to understand how governments and administrations develop customer insight. This third block here is new and I think very important. So for a citizen life event, that aspect of losing a job and finding a job. If it's a bad experience, you lose a job and you stay out of work. And that costs government a lot of money. So how can you get people back into the economy quickly? We're looking at that life experience and also the aspect of business startup. There are 7 different horizontal enablers which I'll show you. E-procurement, we talked about post and pre-award. That's similar but slightly richer. This is an important aspect here in terms of trying to drive the learning and improvement cycle. And then importantly, though it's difficult to get, what we want to do is to show examples of evidence-based improvement. So my understanding is Alton's going to have a report that says, here's the evidence of what's been done in Norway to demonstrate tangible improvement and a business case. And these are the sorts of things that demonstrate to politicians and to civil servants and to the public that we are using technology well in public service delivery. So let me just dig into that a little bit very quickly to show you a bit of a flavour of what can happen. Portugal, interestingly, take the national measure and drive it down to regional levels. Now this year we're collecting the information at what they call the NUTS levels 1 to 5, so you can actually take it down to very discrete small city levels. So you could look at Oslo or Bergen and actually look at comparing at a city to city or a municipality to municipality level. In other words, use the data for more information within a country. So that would be useful. This is a bit of an eye chart in terms of words, but this gives you a flavor in terms of the landscaping. So there's some key situational information, because the key thing is you can't compare Norway with Germany. It doesn't make sense. You've got to compare countries to countries in a sensible way, and there's no country like Norway as there is no country like Germany. So we collect information to help that, which is about some aspects of population, societal figures, government figures in terms of employees and such like public sector expenditure, collecting external information in terms of other indicators, other positionings against various different benchmarking, the priorities that I've talked about, and aspects of the extent to which countries are actually contributing to try and make Europe learn faster. Remember why? Because we're trying to look outside of Europe and influence that. So there's a variety of things that we do on landscaping. This one will be interesting. Lots of words up there. There are 21 data points in terms of the process of starting a business. So we're looking at it from what's up here. Importantly, there's things you have to do to comply. You've got to have registration of a business number. You've got to pay your taxes. That's really boring if you're a businessman. That's about being compliant. It's not actually what you want. So what we're trying to do now is to drive into other aspects of services that public sector can provide, which are actually value-adding, which are going to help the businessman start the business. What I'd like to see moving forward is how we can move to things that the private sector or third sector can also provide to help businesses grow, because that's what we want to do. So this year is the first year that we're looking at those 21 different steps of starting a business. Now, here's some data that says that there's a twofold increase in terms of value add of a foreign business to a national business, and in terms of the employees of a foreign business to a national business is 8 times as much. The Services Directive, which is a current driver, says, let's make it easy for Peter who wants to start up a business in a foreign country. But actually, if you do that, a lot of politicians say, we don't want foreign businesses in here, we prefer to give the jobs to the locals. But if you improve the experience for the foreign business, you'll improve the experience for the local business. If you improve it for startup, you'll also improve it for life operations. That will actually probably make the business more competitive. So this is an important new feature in terms of the benchmarking process this year. Now my hypothesis, and you can quote me on it, is that 80% of Europe right now is non-compliant to the law. And the law in terms of the Services Directive that says that I can start up a business in Portugal, all online, and it's easy. 80% are non-compliant. At a national level, we focus on compliance only. 80% of local administrations don't even know the existence of the Services Directive, and if they do, then they don't look at it as a compliance issue. They look at it in terms of trying to grow the economy locally. But that communication hasn't sufficiently taken place, and this is about Europe being competitive. So I've talked about the process of starting up a business. I start with a data point, the story. I was with a chief executive of one of the councils in the southeast of England, and she said that there was a case where somebody lost their job, and they went down the spiral of the problems of the one income earner losing the job. There was some mental health issues in the family. They started to get on benefits. There was issues about housing. There were some kids' schooling issues. It started to get into a whole convoluted system. And that whole family, not just the person that lost the job, spiraled down and cost the public services in the UK a lot of money. Interestingly, there were 27 visits of assessments of public services to that particular family. And only in 5 of those was there any unique question asked. So here are the silos irritating the customer and wasting public money. Not very good. So what are we doing? We're looking at 27 different data points in terms of the process of losing the job and then finding it again. So a similar set of compliance activities, but also things which are about training, things which are about potentially providing information which is about moving, so locating people in different places. So these are two very big departures in terms of the measurement. So that's the life event. That uses the 20 services and then takes it forward from that in terms of real life activities. There's underneath that an awful lot of important things happening. So the words that you see up there are probably words that we're fairly familiar with: cloud, social media, transparency, openness, trust, broadband availability, etc. What we're doing this year is starting to pick 7 different areas and get some data on those. So are there some authentic sources, some registers that collect information? If they collect them, is it electronic? Is it shared? Is it shared across government? Is it shared with the public? Identity, how is that done? Payment, is there a safe box such that people can actually put and trust their information into a common safe box that they can then provide access to various different public agencies? And from the standpoint of the setup of government, are there some architectural principles, some more technical principles and standards around openness that enable that to happen? So this is a very, very rich tapestry of information around the horizontal enablers of government that we'll have this year. I talked about learning. So it's not just about benchmarking to see who's first on a list. That's interesting maybe, but it's about trying to figure out how you can learn. So part of setting up a hub and spoke in a country, hopefully, is that we then get countries that say, you know what, I'd really like to move forward in terms of understanding how we can optimize channels, how we can move people through the various different face-to-face, to telephone, to online channels. And I'd like to get a club of people together that can actually learn that fast. So who's doing it well, who's got a problem, who wants to aggressively go at it in improvement. So the idea is to pull together 6 to 8 different countries, workshop through some aspect of using online tools to collaborate, produce some learning at the end of it, or even indeed a product, and then share that with the rest of Europe. So that's the learning aspect, which is vitally important. Where can we take the measurement moving forward? Well, I think the most important one is actually to move it away from just availability towards, is this making a difference in terms of outcomes? Talked about regional analysis. An interesting new one is around the speed of policy. So Obama came in and he said, you've got 45 days to do this, 60 days to do that, and 120 days to do the following. And so move fast, please. So there's the question of how fast do we actually deploy policy, create it and deploy it in Europe, and is it fast enough? So speed is an interesting thing. We're currently not measuring that, but I'd love to figure out how we could. And I think there's some areas in terms of domain analysis, talking about some of the wicked issues of the world, either education, tax, some of the service areas, or indeed things like energy and CO2. So I believe there's a lot that we can do to try and drive benchmarking and learning as we move forward. So that's a picture in terms of Europe, the agenda, the measurement, and specifically Norway as well. So I'd like to close on 2 things. One is, let's look at a completely different design, and then let's look at some examples of making things twice as good in half the time for half as much. If you consider on one chart the cost to serve, so how much does it cost government to actually provide services? And at one end of the spectrum you have the nascent, undeveloped countries like Africa and such like. And what's happened over time is we've moved from a position which is putting the basic infrastructure in place to saying, yeah, we're there for the customer, to actually engaging the customer, to move from that aspect of saying, so we're beginning to see to a position where I think a lot of leading countries in Europe are, which is to say, it's a government-driven customer centricity. We as government have decided we know what you need, and so therefore we'll provide services the way that you want it. That can be expensive. If we could move it from government-driven to customer-driven and engage the customer actively in the whole process, then the customer becomes part of the need not to use services. A simple example, you walk outside, I think you're particularly good in Norway. I'm shocking in London. I don't recycle as much as I should. But that's about changing the demand. Consumption of energy in the house, that's about changing the demand. That's happening outside of the public sector. but is certainly reducing the cost of public services. So engaging the public is very important in that. Now this is a term, invisible government, that was used about 2 years ago, and it was sort of in common parlance, government should be invisible. It's a good thing. And I at the time said that's fundamentally wrong. How can you build trust with people if you're invisible? Because trust is what's needed. So this is a picture in terms of trying to drive the whole aspect to a position where you have a completely different set of words which are about innovating the way that you're involving the customer in the process. Co-production is currently a term which is frequently used. Let's look at that picture from the aspect of information technology. So look at the big, thick grey line. That is, if you like, the basis of the firewall of government. Our current experience is that you transact with a particular department, you go in there, you have to go through a passage of saying, this is who I am, this is where I live, this is my family circumstances, and by the way, this is the issue that I have. It's like, oh, by the way, you need to go next door. So you end up chasing your tail around government. It's a U model, it's an administration-centric model. So take that ring and reverse it completely. Build the model from a fundamentally different point. Build it from the customer. Take those same departments and take the information and say some information should be held in the bowels of the organization that says I've been in jail. Some information should be managed with horizontal enablers and shared across departments at the government side. But these days, people want to be involved in the process. So it's really important that we enable that to happen. And this is about making it cheaper and making it better. So it's a new model of designing government. Same picture. This is probably the biggest issue that public services have. How do we actually understand what people want and what people need? You do a census every 5 years or so that tells you how many people are around. You have public consultation meetings that is actually where somebody stands up and complains. But somewhere in between there, what is the structure by which we actually develop customer insights? Until we know that, then we're not going to be able to serve customers best through the right channels. Look at those numbers, the cost of channels. And this is where the horizontal building blocks come in. So we need to fundamentally change the nature of how that's done. One of the things which is important in that is the whole concept of the episode of a service. Life event is sometimes used. Some of those may be about just cleaning the streets, which just happen, hopefully. Some of them are about aspects of human life, birth, marriage, death. Some of them are about starting up a business, and some of them are incidents. So we need to understand how to deal with that. So where I'm positing is that we fundamentally need to design government from a different starting point. Now to the question of twice as good and half the time for half as much. How am I doing for time? Super. I'm going to rattle through some examples. This is a picture of a bike. You know that one. This is a bike in Amsterdam, and it was stolen. That happens a lot. So there was a phone call made to the police. They said, my bike's been stolen. The police said, yeah, what's the number on the bike? I don't know. What happened through the other channel was that using Facebook, Twitter, and social media, there was a message sent out. There was a picture that somebody happened to take. It was posted. So the person that stole the bike felt shockingly embarrassed because it was up there on Facebook, and the guy who lost the bike got his bike back. The police, of course, did nothing about this. So now we're taking services completely outside of public service and delivering it a lot better. And this is happening more and more and more, particularly with young people. Let me show you an example of this here, which is the cost of face-to-face, telephone, and web in euros, not in krona. And half the calls that go in through the telephone turn out to be to the wrong place. So this is a broken front end of government. A good example, not necessarily the best these days, is in Canada, Services Canada. This is a place that you go in, and nobody's allowed to work beyond the age of 30 because it's close to the university. Everybody gets up in public services and has a team meeting in the morning to actually talk about how they're going to serve the customer better. There is no place that it looks like an internet cafe. It isn't. It's a public sector place. All of the department services are presented to you. You can go and use the internet. And there are people that come up and say, what can I do to help? And they represent government. They don't represent a specific department. So this is about redesigning the front end of government and using that 100-fold cost advantage of the 3 costs across the channel by connecting across the channels. Part of that, and I talked about trust, my view is that the Dutch have a leading example of something they call the e-Citizen Charter, which is like a school book. It's about making it easy for people to read. It says 2 things in there which are important. What are the rights of a citizen and the corresponding duty of government? And this allows citizens to call their government to account, so it's a 2-way street. This is, in my view, a sort of very simple set of promises in plain Dutch, and it's been interpreted, or it's been translated into 8 different languages just to indicate that it is particularly good. Here's an example from Australia. They had the Victorian bushfires in 2009. 173 people died. A lot of people lost their homes, and it was altogether a rather bad thing. So government decided they'd throw some money at it. Associations were formed, not-for-profit organizations corralled together, and communities pooled together to make it better. They set up a simple website, and this is effectively the 3 screens. It's obvious. I need to rebuild my house. What do I need to do? And you've got all the various different steps in the process, and for each of those steps it then unpicks it into very simple, plain English, written things that you do, and for each of those things that you do, it gives you access to the regulations in plain, simple, one place to go. It gives you advice on, maybe I need to rebuild my home to be more sustainable, and it shows you videos. So it's a whole collection of access to public, access to private, access to third sector, organizations all in one place around a particular event, and dead easy to use. In Portugal, the old-fashioned way of doing things in terms of registering activities and registering all sorts of aspects have been fundamentally changed. This chap here has done a splendid job in terms of setting up something which is not as good technically as Alton, but I think in totality, given that it's across multiple channels, is very good, around the common registries for people, for businesses, for property and such like. In Wales, the Welsh, normally there's lots of sheep in Wales, but they've done one thing right, which is the structural funds. They get a lot of money from Europe. And what they've done is they've fundamentally changed. So look at the success here. They've changed the process from 5 days to 1 day. That's not twice as good. That's a heck of a lot better than that. In terms of ensuring that money from Europe gets to the people that apply for it easily, faster, more reliably in time. And this is going to be a major issue in the current climate for Europe. We pass over that one. Smart buildings, new technology that really helps to improve how we use energy in both public buildings as well as private buildings. And the government play an important role in this whole chain, though the utility companies clearly have an important role to play in there as well as the public. And my last and favorite story is about Mrs. Ali. Mrs. Ali lives in a place down the southeast of England. In 2006, she spent 57 days in hospital. She has 4 different chronic conditions. Those 57 days weren't in one block, they were 57 individual occurrences. Mrs. Ali's son, who loves his mother, naturally, well, one would hope it would be natural, Mrs. Ali's son left his job. So he suddenly became a burden in terms of the unproductive economy rather than the productive economy. And actually, they too sat in the house and were depressed. So in terms of the close friends and family, it became an issue. So we are taking this down the spiral. In 2007, she spent 0 days in hospital. Why? Because of one simple thing, telehealth. Technology brought to the home, vital signs monitoring, any problem, she can immediately get online with her doctor and have a conversation with the doctor. Dead simple. The son goes back into work. So this isn't making things twice as good in half the time for half the cost. This is making things profoundly better. The intriguing aspect of this was that it's an initiative which wasn't taken by the health department. It was actually taken by a passionate chief executive of the local council because he believed in it. Now, the cost is in the healthcare system. Some of the issues are in the local government system in terms of social care and such like. But as a leader, he said, we need to do this. So he implemented what is Europe's largest telehealth project, or it was at the time. For every pound he spent, he saved £1.20. Not a particularly good business case. For every pound he spent, the health service saved £7. Now the business case makes sense. But health should have really invested. They didn't. So the message behind this is about two things that guy had. One is he would always, always, always focus on the customer. So his whole system was built around the customer. And the second is the bravery of leadership in terms of making the decision. So I started off in terms of saying there's some big issues we need to deal with in the future. There's some big issues in terms of what we have today. It's vitally important we address that. And it's vitally important that you address that in your lifetime. And me. We have a personal responsibility as a customer and as a civil servant. We've looked at how we do that in terms of measurement, and I believe that measurement is absolutely vital, because it's the thing which sometimes upsets, but it drives some progress. And the benchmarking moves to a learning process. It's enriched this year considerably so that it's going to have some additional value to the conversation. That we need to redesign the system fundamentally, and that it is absolutely feasible to deliver services that are twice as good in half the time for half as much. So thank you for listening to a Scotsman speaking English. And if there are any questions, then I'd be more than happy to field them.
Tiden jo snart ute, men vi tar vel tid til etter to spørsmål hvis det noen. Seems like people are
stunned and ready for a beer, probably.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.